Well, here we are today in our 13th session of our online series. We're looking at plague number 8 out of the 9 plague series. This is the plague of locusts. Now, it's the second plague in this last trio of plagues. Therefore, it has a very familiar set of characteristics. First of all, Moses and Aaron will go to Pharaoh, probably around his palace. They're going there to deliver the same old message, let my people go. And they're going there to give a warning of the next plague, the 8th plague, that would begin tomorrow. So there's that day of grace again that's been characteristic ever since Pharaoh used the word tomorrow. God has also been using the word tomorrow. But first, let's take a look at what you maybe always wanted to know about locusts, or maybe you didn't want to know this about locusts. First of all, a locust is nothing but a short horned grasshopper. But when the characteristics are just right, weather and other matters, the grasshoppers can be driven to breed, to swarm, and to migrate, and it's done by external conditions. And when they do that, they can end up numbering as much as 200 million in a square mile. That's a lot of grasshoppers. In ages past, there was no effective method of controlling locusts. When locusts came in, locusts destroyed everything green and left. Right now, interestingly, North America is one of two continents, Antarctica is the other one, where there are no likely problems with locusts. Well, let's go back to the narrative now in Exodus chapter 10, beginning in the first verse. The Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants." Notice, no longer just Pharaoh has a hardened heart. No longer is just Pharaoh in opposition to God. Now the other officials around him are joining him. And he says, "Go to them in order to display these signs of mine before him." These miracles that I'm performing, I want them to be sure and see. Now, verse 2, "And in order that in the hearing of your son and your grandson, you may tell how I made fools of the Egyptians and about my signs that I displayed among them, so that you may know that I am the Lord. I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Well, in this plague, we see already the hearts were made stubborn before the event ever took place. It wasn't the result of the event, it was a precondition for the event. Not only Pharaoh, but also his officials came prepared to resist and to oppose Yahweh. Now, Yahweh had given them over to their own propensities. We saw that last time. When Yahweh hardens his heart, he's essentially telling them, you want it, you got it, do it. God's motivation, however, is clear. He wanted everyone to see a display of his power in such a way that it can be related to future generations. Now, people argue over whether he's telling Pharaoh that it's future generations of his that he wants to know that he was Yahweh. More likely, it is that he wanted the future generations of Israelites to be taught and to understand who this God was and is. Where our translation says made fools of the Egyptians, Some translations say that the Egyptians were judged harshly. Others say that God was making sport of the Egyptians. And that latter is probably closer to the ideal that if you destroy an enemy utterly, you have made sport of him. You've made fun of him. He can't stand up to you. But anyway, I believe that he was wanting to be sure that future Israelites knew how he was involved in the deliverance of the Hebrews from Egyptian bondage. Now, in each of the earlier plagues, we were privy to God's words of instruction to Moses prior to Moses going to Pharaoh. Here, we're first shown what Moses said to Pharaoh, beginning in verse 3. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, how long," there is a new one, he says, "how long do you refuse to humble yourself before me?" Remember that in the last plague, God said to Moses, "You are trying to exalt yourself above everybody, and that's why you're resisting me." Now he says, how long is it going to be before you'll bow the knee to me? And then he goes on to say, "Release my people so that they may serve me. But if you refuse to release my people, I'm going to bring locusts into your territory tomorrow." And of course, the locusts mean destruction of anything green. Verse 5, "They will cover the surface of the earth so that one will be unable to see the ground." In other words, they're going to be so thick you can't see through the mess to even see the ground. "They will eat the remainder of what escaped, what is left over for you from the hail." So he said, whatever the hail didn't finish off out in the fields, the locust will. "And they will eat every tree that grows for you from the field." So they're even going to take care of the trees. "They will fill your houses." Here we go. Back again to the idea of the frogs and the flies. They'll fill your houses. And that "your" is Pharaoh. Pharaoh, they're going to fill your houses, these grasshoppers. "And they're going to fill the houses of your servants and all the houses of Egypt." So you, your officials, you're going to see locusts. The people of Egypt are going to see locusts. They'll see everything that I'm bringing to them. And how much will it be? What will it look like? He goes on to say, "Such that neither your fathers nor your grandfathers have seen since they've been in the land until this day." Nobody's seen anything like this before. Locusts, yes, but not like this. "Then Moses turned and went out from Pharaoh." So we got several things going on. That last one is an interesting one about Moses turning and leaving. We don't think much about it today, but I'll tell you, in those days, you turned your backside to the king and walked out, you could be in a lot of trouble. That was not acceptable protocol. Well, let's go back to the question of how long. Again, remember that in the last plague, in chapter 9, around verse 27, God referred to Pharaoh's need to feel exalted before all people. By nature of being a god in Egypt, he was certainly exalted over the Egyptians, but by blocking the exodus of the Hebrews, he was also trying to be above and exalted above the Hebrews. So when Pharaoh's real need, though, was to humble himself before God, it wasn't a need to be exalted. Remember, God will exalt whoever he exalts, and those he exalts generally are those who are of a humble nature. Well, the command to release the Israelites was followed by a threat of locusts. every time there was a threat or there was a warning of a threat, the threat followed the warning, not before. So that's the same thing here. There was a warning of a problem if you don't let them go. In this case, the warning was about locusts will overrun you. Now, how did God use locusts? Well, it's an interesting notion in Joel. In Joel 2:25, Joel calls the locusts God's great army. Let me read it. I will make up for the years that the Arba locust, that's just some particular branch of the locust family, I guess, before they consume your crops. The Yelek locust, another one, and the Hasil locust, a third one, and the Gazam locust, a fourth type, I guess. I call them my great army that I sent against you. In this case, as I recall, God is sending these locusts, his army of locusts, against his own people in judgment. So what has Moses just said? Well, Pharaoh, you got 24 hours to think about this and decide how you want to react. God is saying, you refuse me, get to him eventually. If you refuse me, Pharaoh, the locusts will finish the job begun by the hail. Whatever was left untouched by the hail, the locusts are going to finish it off and destroy it. So like frogs and flies, locusts will invade your own homes. You and your henchmen are not going to be exempt from this. And like the hailstorm, ain't nothing like this been seen in Egypt before. Remember, he said the hailstorm was of unprecedented magnitude. So he's going to say same thing here. This invasion of locusts is going to be unprecedented in magnitude and destruction. And so when Moses delivered that message, he turns his back on Pharaoh and leaves. And again, remember, that's a dangerous thing to do. But now what about Pharaoh's officials, those whose hearts were hardened? They were probably yes men for the most part. But now, starting in verse 7, we're going to see that they've changed their mind. Let me read verse 7 for you. Pharaoh's servants said to him, to Pharaoh, how long will this man, Moses, be a snare to us? Release the people, the Hebrews, so that they may serve the Lord their God. They're using Yahweh here. They're recognizing that this is not just any old God. This is Yahweh, the Lord. Do you not know that Egypt is destroyed? So the Pharaoh's officials had a question of how long of their own. God said, how long are you not going to bow the knee? These guys said, how long are you going to put up with this, Pharaoh? But they were fairly smart. Here's what they did. They interceded on behalf of the Hebrews in spite of their hardened hearts. They blamed Moses for their problems. They're not going to blame Pharaoh, of course, but keep an eye out. They labeled the Hebrews as bad news. So their advice, you gotta get them out of here or give them what they want, Pharaoh. But their tone seems to be showing a little impatience to Pharaoh, as if to say, hey, don't you realize what's going on, Pharaoh? Get these guys out of here. They saw the handwriting on the wall. They saw the ever-increasing severity of the plagues and the damage it was doing to their country. So their position left Pharaoh isolated and alone in his stubbornness. At least that's what it appears. But evidently, Pharaoh got that message. So during the one-day grace period, the tomorrow thing, he did something that he'd never done in any other place. During this grace period, he calls Moses and Aaron back in again. So let's begin in verse 8. So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to them, "Go serve the Lord your God." Oh, by the way, this is going to interject another question here. Exactly who's going with you? Moses said, "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and with our sheep and our cattle we will go, because we are told to hold a pilgrim feast for the Lord." Now, at this stage, Moses didn't really know what that pilgrim feast was going to be like. They had never been established. So Moses said, "We have to take everybody and everything because we don't know what might be required of us." Verse 10, he said to them, "The Lord will need to be," this is Pharaoh speaking, "the Lord will need to be with you if I release you and your dependents. Watch out. Trouble is right in front of you." Pharaoh's saying, "Hey, if I let you go, there's going to be problems, and you better look for God's help when I come after you." That's fundamentally a kind of threat, but veiled somewhat. And then Pharaoh continues, "No, go, you men only, and serve the Lord, for that's what you want. You want to go serve the Lord? You typically only require men to do these things, so go." So he's saying, no, leave your women, your children, your livestock back here in Egypt. You guys can go out, do your thing, and then come back. Then Moses and Aaron were driven out of Pharaoh's presence. Notice Pharaoh didn't wait this time for Moses to turn his back on him and walk out. He actually had him forcibly removed. At least I assume it could have been forcible. It said he was driven out, so I don't know exactly how that took place, but anyhow, they left. This was a negotiation of sorts that was taking place during this grace period, and that was a first again, as we said. Pharaoh's actions here may indicate that he was getting the notion that Yahweh could and would pull off what was threatened. I mean, he'd already seen it 7 times, so this 8th time wouldn't have been any big deal. Pharaoh's in a high-stakes poker game, one that, of course, he can't possibly win, but he's playing it for all it's worth. Let me ask you a question. It goes back to the point of why all this is even taking place. Have you ever given thought to why keeping the Hebrews as slaves, making bricks, was such a high priority with Pharaoh? What is it about bricks, anyhow? Well, of course, this was a time when Egyptians were building major cities, quite often to honor a given pharaoh. So this was an economic thing. They needed slaves to perform an economically payoff or an economical payoff, and they were making bricks as part of their responsibility. Well, whatever you think about that, the conversation could be modernized something like this. So I'm going to go back and give you the Don's version of how this might have gone if we were just talking back and forth. So Pharaoh says, "Okay, go. Oh, by the way, who all's going?" Moses, "All of us and our livestock." Pharaoh, "Whoa, no, 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 no. Not that. Only the men can go. You can do whatever you want without the women and the children." Well, again, Moses didn't walk out in this particular case. Moses was thrown out. But God had other plans and other ideas again. And it seems like it's always the case with Pharaoh. So let's look at beginning in verse 12. "And the Lord said to Moses," now here's where we're going to find out what Moses was told by God before it actually took place. "Lord said to Moses, extend your hand over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come up over the land of Egypt and eat everything that grows in the ground, all that the hail has left." Just as the threat was. He said, Now, Moses, let's get it on. So Moses extended his rod. There again, we got the rod and Moses' words. Moses has told Pharaoh this. Now he uses his rod. Both are involved. We have the trigger. This thing's going to go on. So Moses extended his rod over the land of Egypt, and then the Lord brought an east wind on the land all that day and night. The morning came, and the east wind had brought up the locusts. They were now, what do we say? They are now swarming and they're migrating thanks to the wind. The locusts went up over all the land of Egypt and settled down all in the territory of Egypt. It was very severe. There had been no locusts like them before, and now Moses adds, nor will there be ever such again. They covered, that's the locust, covered the surface of all the ground so that the ground became dark, and they ate all the vegetation of the ground and all of the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. So whatever the hail didn't get, the locust did. Nothing green remained on the trees or on anything that grew in the fields throughout all of the land of Egypt. So what do we have? Widespread, just devastation. And that probably was going to lead to the idea of more death in Egypt because now all their crops were gone. God promised that the locusts would finish the job started by the hail. They did. Probably billions of locusts over the land. Anything green? Gone. Any fruit? Gone. It's kind of interesting. Let's take a moment out now and let me give you a list of some of the gods that Yahweh could have been taking on at this point in time, or embarrassing, however you want to look at it. The first is Serapia, Serapia, who was the god of the locusts. He neither could cause them nor stop them. The next one is Nepri, Nepri. He was a god that was supposed to be protecting the grain. Well, that didn't work out so good either. Nepit, Nepit, a goddess of grain. She didn't help much either. Renenutet, or however you pronounce it, Renenutet, was the goddess of agriculture. Another failure. Emutet, Emutet, goddess of crops. Another failure. Shu, Shu, the god of the wind in the air. Well, God used the wind to bring the locusts in. We'll see in a minute, he uses the wind to take them out also. And then there is a god we've seen before, Set, who is the god of storms and chaos. So, and of course, Pharaoh is supposed to be the god who keeps order. And of course, locusts are a form of disorder, a very strong form of disorder. Well, the consequences caused Pharaoh to bring back Moses and Aaron again. This is what, the third time in this plague that they've been in and out? Verse 16, then Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. There's a true statement of confession. Remember in the previous one, he had 3 statements of truth in his confession. So here we go again. He's truthfully saying, I've blown it, I've sinned before God, your God, I've sinned before you. So now forgive my sin this time only. He's not asking for forgiveness for anything done earlier. Remember last time, he had only admitted to sinning in the case of the hail. Now he's admitting to sinning here, but he's only asking forgiveness for this one time. And pray, here's what, 4th time? Pray to the Lord your God that he may take away from me this death only. Strange to call locusts death, but they can end up causing death, of course, because of all the crop damage. So Pharaoh admits his sin, asks for prayer and a removal of the consequences. Remember, that's always been the problem. Before Pharaoh would change his heart, the consequences are removed, so he didn't bother to change his heart. But what's happened here? Well, the Egyptians have seen God's power up close and personal. Even the officials with hardened hearts are recognizing that. And apparently, Pharaoh's starting to get the word also. It doesn't mean he's going to do anything about it, but he's getting the word. They knew that God had directed all of the events of these plagues. This is the 8th one. There's one more to go. Pharaoh admits his sin. He asks for forgiveness, and then he asks for the removal of the consequences before changing his heart. So what happened? Well, verse 18, Moses went out from Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord. And the Lord turned a very strong sea wind. I guess that must mean off the Mediterranean. And it picked up the locusts and threw them into the Red Sea. How many locusts are gone? Not one locust remained in all the territory of Egypt. Remember when God took care of the flies? Every fly died. Now every locust is gone. When God does a job, he does it only the way that he can do it. Getting rid of every single one of billions of locusts, that ain't totally natural. You may use nature, the wind, to blow them out, but he had to make sure it happened. He had to coordinate it, his timing. And by the way, said the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and he did not release the Israelites. I would bet you that the locusts did not touch Goshen. Okay? In other words, God is still protecting the Israelites from the consequences of these plagues. So what happened? Well, wind brought the locusts in, so much for the gods of the wind, like Seth. Wind takes them out, every last one of them. But God wasn't finished, and he wasn't ready to let Pharaoh off the hook. Pharaoh asked for forgiveness. Yeah, maybe he got it, maybe he didn't. I don't know what God did in that case. But God's not finished yet. Not only is there the 9th plague, but remember, there's the episode of the Passover that follows. Well, let me give you a couple takeaways again. First one, God routinely gives individuals time to think about his claims, but there's a limit to his patience with opposition. That's going to come up very, very soon. God is patient, but only to a point. He uses his patience to give everyone an opportunity to respond positively to him. Second, the refusal to humble oneself before God is a roadblock to reconciliation with him. If you won't bow the knee to Yahweh, you're never going to be reconciled to not Yahweh. And then one more time, a confession may consist of all or entirely true statements and yet come from an unrepentant heart. Judas Iscariot was one example of such. Well, next time, the plague of darkness is going to come, but since it's the 3rd plague in the last trio, it's going to come without warning. And it's going to be aimed at one of the 2 principal gods of the Egyptians. Remember, Hapi, the god associated with the flooding of the Nile, was the A major god, 1st plague. Now on the 9th plague, it's going to be Re, R-A, the god of the sun or the god of light. And what's the plague about? Darkness. We'll see you then.